Good evening and welcome to the Hollywood Babylonians. Hello, friends. This is your happy Hollywood history host, Mr. Ben Burke, here with another episode of the Hollywood Babylonians, your favorite classic film and Hollywood history podcast, in which we talk about the greatest classic films of old Hollywood and the history behind them. And today, we are privileged, we are lucky, we are blessed to have an amazing person with us today, the host of the Front Row Classics podcast, which is a national public radio podcast, Mr. Brandon Davis. Brandon, how are you?
I am doing great, Ben. Thank you so much
Good.
for having me. This is a thrill.
Oh, of course. It's a thrill for me too. When you first messaged me several months ago and were like, I love your content, I was just like, this is amazing. Because Brandon, he not only discusses classic films, but he has some of the best guests on, in my opinion. Ben Mankiewicz, Patricia Kelly Ward, who's Gene Kelly's widow, all of those people. Brandon, I am amazed at how you get those people. Do you just like find how do you?
No, well, it's pretty remarkable. One of my best friends started our podcast network. It's called the Front Row Network,
Okay.
and originally it was just him and a couple of his friends talking about the newest releases, and then he wanted to expand it, and so then I was always the classic film fan, and so he asked me to start my own show, Front Row Classics. So I did it for a couple of years, and then just went fine. We just discussed movies and did movie reviews. And then
Mhm.
during the pandemic, one of my other friends who hosts our Disney podcast
Mhm.
just started reaching out to various, Disney legends and things like that. And really, the pandemic, for as much as we wish it didn't happen, it really did
Yeah.
sort of help us out because people who usually sat at home, who usually were busy, were kind of just sitting at home doing nothing, so they had time to give us. So that kind of just started the ball rolling. And when one person said yes, just more happened. And so yeah, I just started getting more and more contacts and the ability to contact publicists and things like that, and that's how it got started.
That is amazing. Yeah, and I can this podcast definitely came out of the pandemic. I've
Hmm.
just sitting at home with my parents and having nothing to do and coming up with this a podcast, and I'm quite the perfectionist. So, for every movie, it's like I have to read every book and watch every
Yeah.
documentary and create a 20-page report before I can do any podcast. So sometimes it moves a bit slower than I'd like it to,
Hmm.
and at times it's like, is all of this really worth it? But I think at the end it is, because you start to see growth and you start to see interest and different people want to be a part of it, which is awesome. Like the amazing Brandon Davis from Illinois. But and that's awesome that you have like an entire network of podcast friends. So you
Yes.
you just hopped on that train and you wrote it. You're still writing it.
Yeah, we do. We've got, like I mentioned, we have a Disney show. We have a group that does a show called Flashbacks, which is more sort of 80s, 90s fare. And then
Awesome.
we have a host named Lou Hare. He does a show called Guilty Pleasures, which really deals in sort of the seedier side of movie going, but it's a lot of fun. And so, yeah, we cover all the
Amazing.
bases.
Awesome. That is so cool. Okay, so starting out, I want to ask you just so we can feel out Brandon Davis and get to know
Mhm.
who he is. I want to know your history with classic film, your kind of introduction. How was it indoctrinated into you since childhood? What happened?
Well, I think like most everybody, from birth, I think everyone's first sort of introduction to classic films would be sort of through Disney, through
Mhm.
the older Disney classics, and then of course The Wizard of Oz and things like that. So that was always my basis. But then I want to say around the time I was probably like 8 or 9. I spent a lot of time with my grandma, and she
Mhm.
loved movies growing up. And so anytime I would go visit her or whatever, she would always have a new VHS of it started out kind of with classic musicals. So
Right.
it started out with the Rodgers and Hammerstein stuff. So Sound of
Mhm.
Music, Oklahoma, King and I. And then really with me, I don't know exactly what it was, but it grabbed me. And all of a sudden I would latch on to like a star in a certain movie and I'd be like, oh, I want to see what else they did.
Mhm.
Or I want to see, other things like this. So it was really kind of more self discovery on my part, with her sort of being my introduction into everything.
That is awesome, and yeah, it was similar for me. I spent a lot of time growing up with my grandparents, and it was either TV Land or, TCM on all of the
Hmm.
time, and then we started going to the public library in Hastings, and I started hoarding VHSs. I still have a lot of those. I will not get rid of them
No.
because of sentimental reasons. But yeah, and it started out with classic musicals for me, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And as you get older, you get interested in more of the mature work,
Yeah.
which is kind of what happened to me with this film that we are about to talk about. Also, we are here to discuss a very, very important film today. I think it's our 10th film with the Hollywood Babylonians. By the time this episode comes out, it'll be our 10th film, and it is Casablanca from Warner Brothers in 1942. It's starring Ingrid Bergman, Humphrey Bogart, directed by Michael Curtiz, with Peter Lorre, S.C. Zakal, Sidney Greenstreet, Paul Henrid, you name it, they got it. So I wanted to know first and foremost, because when we were talking about classic film messaging you, Brandon, you said Casablanca is your favorite. I want to know, out of why all of these millions, not millions, but thousands of other classic films, why this is your favorite.
It sounds like a cliche for a classic film fan to say that Casablanca is their favorite, but honestly, honest truth, it is, because I can't think of another movie. It's funny, if you ask me, like, what my favorite, performance in a movie is, or what my favorite
Hmm.
screenplay of a movie is, I might say All About Eve is my favorite screenplay, or Jimmy Stewart's performance in Vertigo is my favorite performance, but when you add every single piece and every single element that it took to make Casablanca, it is like this perfect souffle, and
Hmm.
everything just complements each other. And uh, all of these different elements came together. And I don't necessarily buy the theory that it was such an accident that everything happened. I think these were craftsmen who knew what they were doing,
Hmm.
but I mean, they certainly didn't know they had, a masterpiece for the ages on their hands, but
Hmm.
everything about it works. And I said this, when we talked about this on my show. For me, it's like a favorite, like, music album. It's like when you put on, like, the Beatles' White Album or Carole King's Tapestry or something. The more I
Hmm.
watch it and the more I listen to it, the more I love it and the more I'm familiar with it. And it doesn't get old. And the performances still work, and everything about it is just great. I mean, even it's such a high stakes dramatic setting, and the look of it and everything, it just all works.
It does. It works perfectly. It's almost like, well, I don't want to call it an anomaly, but it almost feels like that's what it is, because every element that was working in the Warner Brothers studio is a part of this film. I mean, you have the
Mhm.
Golden Boys, Michael Curtiz and producer Hal Wallace working
Yes,
together. You have Arthur Edison, who was a Warner Brothers cinematographer for years and years and years.
the best.
Yes, Humphrey Bogart, and it is when I first saw it in fifth grade, I was like, "Oh, this is kind of Warner Brothers stock melodrama." As I got older, I realized that somehow all of these different elements came together in a perfect Warner Brothers melodrama, and I think it has something to do with not only the fact that it was a melodrama, but the fact that you're layering on all of these real life things that were happening at the time.
Yeah.
It's not just a love story between Bogart and Bergman. It is an ensemble film, and without the ensemble, you don't have the full effect of the film. When was the first time you saw Casablanca?
It was, I want to say I was in junior high, probably. It was
Okay,
around like sixth, seventh, eighth grade, somewhere around there. But I got a DVD of it for Christmas, and
nice.
I put it in and watched it. And I mean, certainly I had seen pieces of it before then, but this is the
Hmm.
first time I actually, and that age is sort of around the time when you can really appreciate, I was sort of a veteran classic film fan by that time, but mainly like in the musical category or comedies or things like that. And so now I was maturing to other fare. And so I had seen Bogart before, because I knew the African Queen by then,
Hmm.
and I knew a couple of other of his work, but to actually sit down and watch it, and I think somehow I had been immune to, when you show somebody something like Casablanca or Citizen Kane or something like that, and there is so much hype around that movie,
Mhm,
you almost feel like you're in for a disappointment because people build up so many expectations in their mind. I didn't have too many expectations when I watched it.
mhm,
So I really watched it fresh, and it captured me right away.
right.
And I fell in love with the setting, I fell in love with the characters, and it has always held on to my imagination and my heart ever since then.
Right. Well, that is awesome. Yeah, and it's like you said, very first thing, say that you're a classic film lover and you love Casablanca
Mhm,
is seems so cliche because
mhm.
we're classic film lovers, so we like to say that we love things that are more obscure than
Yes.
that. And everybody talks about Casablanca like, it's the best thing ever, and it really is. I don't think it's a cliche to say that. I mean, talking about you also said that Round Up the Usual Suspects which I just finished reading, which was a
Mhm.
trip, is your favorite Casablanca book. Have you read any others?
I read We'll Always Have Casablanca, which
Okay.
came out a couple of years ago and is a really good book too. I recommend that. That came out, I want to say like 4 or 5 years ago. And then I've read several of the Warner Brothers books, and I've read books on Bogart.
Mhm.
Eric Lax, who's a great biographer of Bogart. I recommend any of his stuff. But I think Round Up the Usual Suspects is the most complete, and I think gives you the best sort of all around detail of just the production and the politics at Warner Brothers and the politics in the US at the time. It just covers everything.
Right, and I messaged you, I said, "Warner Brothers did not sound like a place I wanna work in the '30s and '40s." I mean, you hear stories from the studio system,
Mhm,
and just the stories that you've heard before Olivia de Havilland came in with her Law
mhm,
and, the Paramount deal in 1948, you're like, "Whew, that sounded like just a toxic work environment." But even more so Warner Brothers, because it was a very structured work environment. It
mhm,
sounded like, the biggest stars were having to fight their way to their favorite projects, except
mhm.
Errol Flynn, who I don't really think cared.
No.
But no, which is fine. We
Yeah.
still love him.
I love watching, old Dick Cavett shows, and
Mhm.
of course, one of his best interviewees was Betty Davis, and she was
Yeah.
talking about how, Jack Warner, lost all of his hair early because he had to deal with me, Bogart, and Cagney, because she said, "I think between the 3 of us, we all had dozens of suspensions."
Yes, which is perfectly fine. I think it's well worth those suspensions were well worth it for the films that we did get.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
and
Definitely.
the fact yeah, also Hal Wallace, the fact so many of those great films that we love, he produced, and he was
Mhm,
producing back to back to back. A lot of Casablanca was, put on hold, the schedule was, or people came in late because they were all working on Now Voyager, which is
mhm.
another great Warner Brothers film. I don't
Yes, it is.
know if it holds up as well as Casablanca almost feels timeless. Like there is something about it that still feels modern.
Mhm,
Whereas Now Voyager, it has a great emotional arc of finding yourself in the
mhm.
world, but maybe it's just Betty Davis's acting, which I'm a fan of, but
You need some context for Now Voyager because I think Betty Davis's performance is fine. I think
mhm.
its view of psychiatry is a little more primitive than what we're used to nowadays. So you really have to sort of put yourself in a 1942 mindset when you watch that movie.
Yes, for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I think her performance, yeah, being Betty Davis, oh my goodness, love
Yeah.
her film so much. But I wanted to also talk about Round Up the Usual Suspects. One of the things that I think this book does so well to put the film into historical context and kind of understanding, because it can also relate to today, is that almost every person on this film was some sort of a European refugee who had fled from Europe because of Hitler, and that's
Mhm,
exactly what the entire film was about.
mhm.
And I listened to your set. You did two podcasts on Casablanca, I think, on Front Row Classics, and I listened to the second one today. And one interesting thing that one of your co-hosts, I'm sorry, I don't know their names.
Sure.
Love listening to both of them,
Sure.
but one of them said, people always call Hollywood, liberal Hollywood these days, and they're like, oh, what happened to the good old days, like the, the 40s and 50s. And it's like, no, it was still liberal Hollywood, because the
Mhm.
Warners had both been Jewish, were, they were against Hitler, what he stood for, and there were many members of the Republican Party at the time that had allied themselves with the Nazi regime, and a certain Nazi agent who was using Congress to send out Nazi propaganda to the American people. So this film that vilified Nazis actually was considered leftist, because a lot of the people on the right allied themselves with the Nazis. Anyway, I was wondering what some of your favorite. Well, first of all, do you have a favorite character in this movie?
Oh, that's hard. I mean, okay, Rick aside, I
Mhm.
think I think Rick is who you identify with. It's who you pull for the whole movie. I love Claude Rains as Louis Renault. That he's somebody who, if you knew in real life, you would find despicable, but
Mhm.
on the screen,
Yeah.
he you cannot get enough. I think we mentioned it in our podcast. You are as much invested in the Rick and Louis relationship as you are in the Rick and Ilsa relationship,
Oh yeah.
because throughout the movie there is such an unspoken subtext between the two of them, because they can't say what they really feel
Right.
throughout the whole movie. Even in the privacy to each other, they don't dare say it.
Mhm.
And so finally, at the end, when they finally can show their real allegiance to each other, and when they walk off together at the end, you feel vindicated. And I think that's why the movie works, because Rick loses Ilsa, and the love story we've been rooting for ends tragically, and yet this other relationship we're invested in is going on. And so I think that gives it such a cathartic feel at the end. And so yeah, I think that's one of the all-time great movie characters, Louis Renault.
Yeah, well, Renault also, yeah. And beautifully played by Claude Rains.
Mhm.
Every time people ask me who's my favorite old Hollywood actor, I always say Claude Rains, and they're like, "Really?" Because he wasn't he wasn't like Gregory Peck or Cary Grant.
Yeah, right.
But I
But
think
but look at the span of work he did,
I
and every
know.
kind of character.
And I think well, Notorious is very haunting, but I think this
Mhm.
performance, and even though it's not considered a great film, his performance in Deception
It's very good.
oh yeah, it's phenomenal. A party
And
indeed. Yes, it
and
is.
and Mr. Skeffington, he's really good in.
Oh yes. Well, yeah, he's really good in
Mhm,
everything, and I feel
mhm,
like I don't know. He says some stuff about Rick, like if I were a woman, he'd be the first man
mhm.
I would want to go to, and they say stuff back and forth like that. So that there's undertones of that, and then the overtone of him and Elsa and Ingrid Bergman, which is just perfect chemistry. Even though I don't think
Mhm.
they like fought it out, but they never did really get. They were never fast friends, is my understanding.
Right. Well, and what's Ingrid Bergman's line that she used to say? I kissed Bogart, but I never knew him,
Yeah.
or something like that. So I don't think I think they were I think they were both very different people who were incredibly professional and did their
Mhm.
jobs very well. And Bogart was going through a tough time at the time. He was in a rocky marriage, which would eventually end, and a couple years later, he would, meet Lauren Bacall, and that would become history.
Right.
But and then, this is a movie that no one really, I think, put much stock in. So I think everyone was just ready to move on to the next thing. It's pretty well documented that Ingrid Bergman really wanted to do For Whom the Bell Tolls, which was the
Right.
next movie that she did. And so I just think everyone came, did their job, and went home. And I'm sure Bogart and Rains and Greenstreet and Laurie, they were all good friends, so they all kind of but Bergman, I'm sure, just kind of felt, this is a job, and I'm ready just to get it done and move on.
Right. I've read some of her autobiography. I know at the time she really wanted For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Right.
And at their last filming week in August, she got the call from, I think it was Paramount, that she had
Hmm.
gotten the job after they had given it to somebody else that I can't remember her name, but I know she was
Hmm.
European and nobody could understand her. So they got rid of her. Ingrid Bergman took that role, but beginning before Casablanca, she had made films for David O. Selznick. I think she made that one, Intermezzo.
Intermezzo.
Yeah, and then she made Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with Metro, and I
Hmm.
know she didn't. All of a sudden, there was kind of a stall out on her career, and she did not get along with her husband that well, and
Hmm.
she felt like she was trapped up in New York. So she wrote, I think it was a friend or like an acting coach, that she just longs for the day when she can go back to work. And I don't ever think Casablanca was her, what was her ever favorite project, but I think she was thankful to be back on set. I know, and you talked about on your podcast too, the fact that people always told her how much they loved her in Casablanca, which her daughter said made her angry because they kept rewriting the script over and over and over again. She never knew who she was going to be in love with. But I think the name of the game in Casablanca is ambiguity, which makes it still feel like a modern film.
Yes.
Because she never knew exactly who she was in love with, who she was supposed to be in love with, neither do we.
Right.
And that's what makes the ending feel okay, is that she goes, we don't know, she doesn't even know who she's in love with. But I know that the production code, because at the end she leaves Rick and she goes away with Paul Henrid, the production code wouldn't have allowed her in that day and time to run away with Rick.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you said, I think the ambiguity, it makes everything feel like it's all in real time, and we're
Right.
we're we're figuring it out as she's figuring it out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of why the movie stays fresh. And then yeah, you're right. I think, we hear all the time about how the Epsteins and Howard Koch, who were doing the screenplay, couldn't figure out who she was going to end up with, and that may very well be true. But in the end, the production code is, husbands have to stay with their wives, and if they don't, they get punished somehow. So she went off
Yeah.
with Bogart. They probably would both have to die in a plane crash or something
Exactly, to
like
punish them for their actions. It's just ridiculous. But we were talking, okay, first I want to address like ambiguity.
that.
This film, they're their own flawed character. Nobody
Hmm.
is white, nobody is black, which is very
No.
different from other films. Everybody is practically gray, and Rick is, of course, I don't want to say one of the first, but one of the first anti-heroes on film. I don't think we truly get film noir until the following year with The Woman in the Window. That's what makes it feel so modern, is because so many modern movies, there's no good guys, there's no bad guys, everybody has their own flaws. And that is definitely true for everybody living in Casablanca, which brings us to our next point. As time goes by, well, okay, first, I'm sorry, I'm
Yeah.
all over the place.
Oh, go ahead.
But
No.
the movie was based on the play Everybody Comes to Rick, which was an
Yes.
unpublished play by, I think, a man named, his last name was Murray,
Murray
and
Burnett.
Murray Burnett, yes.
Hmm.
And then is it
Joan Allison.
Joan Allison? Yeah,
Hmm.
not June Allison, but Joan Allison.
Not June.
Another
That would have
favorite.
been interesting.
I know, that would have been interesting. That would have been a lot happier play. But yeah, it was based on Everybody Comes to Rick. The song As Time Goes By was an old song that had been written in the early 30s from a play that was on Broadway called Everybody's Welcome. And As
Right.
Time Goes By was one of the highlights for that Broadway play. It did very well for the play. And I know Ann Sothern was one of the stars, and that's before she took on the Metro Goldwyn Mayer role of Ann Sothern. I can't even remember what her name was before Ann Sothern. I know you got the look on
I'm
your
trying to
face.
think of it too.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember.
Well, and I'm also trying to think, was Ann Southern with RKO or MGM first? I can't remember. But you're lucky.
I think she went. I think she went to MGM. She was with
It was
RKO
MGM.
first. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
RKO
yeah. And,
first.
and then she went to MGM. Yeah.
Okay.
Her
I
real
know.
name was Harriet Lake. That's what it
There
was.
we go. Harriet
That's
Lake.
what it was.
But the fact that all of these characters seem real, everybody's welcomed. It was speculated in the Round Up the Usual Suspects, the book, that Everybody Comes to Rick's was kind of a takeoff on Everybody's Welcome, because they used a song from Everybody's Welcome.
Mhm.
And everybody being like all of these different refugees, all of these different types of people. There's a very moving moment in the film when they're singing, the Nazis are singing their song, and then the French are singing the Marseillaise, that it's like all of these different conflicting people have all come together. And us being human beings, we're all flawed. There's no good, there's no bad, which
Mhm.
is a part of the, it's a Rick's Cafe American is a symbol for the world in general, which I
Right.
think is why it touched so many people, because it was so ridiculously did such a wonderful job at the box office for Warner Brothers, more than other Bogart films had.
Definitely. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, if you think about it, Bogart had been kind of he was the heavy. until Maltese Falcon. But Sam Spade's not a shining character either.
No.
So this is really the first time he's playing a romantic lead, and so this was sort of out of the realm for Bogart. And I mean, it's funny when you look at some of the stuff he did in the late 30s. He
Mhm.
did horror movies, he did westerns, and he plays
Betty
the
Davis's stable boy.
the stable with an
Y-
Irish with a bad Irish accent.
Yeah.
And 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 so yeah, I think this is the movie. Well, Maltese Falcon is when he starts to really get into the Bogart persona, but this is when he steps into sort of Bogart the icon,
Mhm.
and he never loses that until he passes away about 15 years after this.
Mhm.
But you're right. Yeah, this is pure Bogart, and nobody was better at walking that line between black and white like he did. And
Right.
it's a fascinating character, and it's so amazing to me because he is such a perfect screen actor.
Mhm.
It's hard for me to think of him on the stage the way that he started out, because he's so good at being subtle,
Mhm.
and the camera just picks up every little movement that he does so well, and he knows how to work the camera. And yeah, I mean, it's just and this is one of those perfect screen performances.
Oh, yeah, and I think you were saying that on what the podcast I was listening to today, is that he is fantastic because he is so subtle. I think so many of the
Hmm.
great Hollywood male stars of the time, the fantastic ones, Spencer Tracy, Claude Rains, Humphrey Bogart, were fantastic because they were subtle. I know Spencer Tracy said acting is the easiest thing in the world as long as you don't let anybody catch you doing it,
Yep.
especially on film. And,
Hmm.
for the time also, you look at somebody like Betty Davis, who had come from the New York theater, and you're like, I wonder what these guys looked like on stage, if they were anything like
Yeah.
Betty Davis. But I know the Maltese Falcon. I guess iconic Bogart. Really, the class that we see comes from Casablanca. I know a lot of the films that he took at Warner Brothers were B pictures that had been turned down by George Raft, and by the time they finished the Maltese Falcon, because that was, I think, a little bit more successful than they had planned it to be. The Warner Brothers press department wrote a letter. I'm not sure if it was Hal Wallace or Jack Warner that said we need to start looking at projects for Bogart, not George Raft, not George
Who
Raft to
who
Bogart,
had the
but
George
right.
Raft had the worst taste in taking roles, because what is it? He turned down Maltese Falcon, and then he
Mhm.
turned down the Fred McMurray role in Double Indemnity. So
I mean, and obviously the guy had no idea what a good script was.
mm,
I know I haven't seen many George Raft films. The only one I can think up off the top of my head is I think he was in, it was either Hell on Frisco Bay, or
mhm.
was he
I
in
think
that,
you're
or was
I
he
think you're
in
right. Yeah.
Black Widow? I can't remember what it was, like, either Warner
Yeah.
Brothers or Fox film for the mid 50s.
Mhm.
But the only thing I know much about George Raft is that when Lucy first came to Hollywood and was fired by Samuel Goldwyn,
Uh-huh.
he was one of the ones that got her the job at RKO.
He was smart enough to take the role of Spats Columbo and Some Like It Hot years later, though. So I'll give him
Yes.
that.
What are some of your favorite moments from this film?
Um,
The entire film
the,
is
the,
your favorite
the
moment.
the easier question would be, what are not my favorite
Okay, what are not your
moments?
favorite
No,
moments?
no, no. It's I go back and forth so much, but my favorite moment in the movie, really, it's the moment that gives me chills and gives me a lump in the throat every time, and it's the as time goes by moment
Hmm.
when Ilsa first reconnects with Sam, and it's like I said, this movie is so great at unspoken subtext,
Yeah.
and it's the unspoken thing as subtext between them, and then of course it's the famous play it Sam, play as time goes by, and he's weary about playing it, but he does, and Dooley Wilson is so great at singing that song. And then Rick walks in, and that whole section where the two of them reconnect, and the first time viewing, you don't know the history between them, but you feel the history between them.
Hmm.
And then the second time you watch it, when you know the history between them, it's an even greater meaning.
Right.
And so that's what I love about this movie is it rewards you both times on your first viewing and on subsequent viewings. But yeah, that as time goes by moment in a sea of great moments. I think
Hmm.
that's the one that always sticks out to me.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is a beautiful moment. I think the exposition of this film is so fantastically well done, more than other films, except
Mhm.
maybe The Letter, that just scares the tar out of you from the very first.
Right.
But yeah, the fact it starts off like a documentary, and the fact it's almost like
Mhm.
watching the sequence in Schindler's List when you're watching all of these
Mhm.
Jews being boarded onto this train. It's like the exposition of all of these refugees that have been affected by this war too. And then whoever wrote it, I know it does a beautiful job of introducing all of the characters at the very beginning of the film. You learn everything you need to know about everything, and it seems like everybody has a purpose in that opening scene, even though it is just exposition. I know
Mhm.
Sidney Greenstreet was not supposed to be in the opening scene. Hal B. Wallace could only get him if he gave him an extra scene. So
Yeah.
that's why he put him in that introduction. But yeah, the cafe takes on its own world, which is what I appreciate so much. It may not be a specific moment, but just being in the cafe and knowing that there's all sorts of different types of people in there at all times.
And you mentioned it a little bit earlier. It is like kind of it's an amalgamation of the world in Rick's
Hmm.
Cafe right there. And because nobody can get in and out of Casablanca without, specifically following these crazy rules in order to get out,
Right.
and to have those, magical letters of transit. It's like everybody is stuck in this location, and I think that's why this movie also fascinates everybody. It's that I can't think of another movie that has such a setting that has, high stakes and romance and intrigue, everything all at the same time. And it looks fantastic. When here you are in the middle of, Northern Africa, and you're in this glamorous nightclub that looks like it would be in New York or someplace like that. And everyone is dressed to the nines.
Right.
And then also you have got that, what a brilliant touch it was. I don't know if it was Curtiz or Arthur Edison or who it was to have, the searchlight constantly going around too, and which gives it that sort of extra bit of suspense as well. It's just everything. Like we said before, every decision that was made with this movie just works and it all came together.
Oh, for sure. And, everybody being in that nightclub, there are so many people in Casablanca, they're basically in limbo.
Yeah,
And Major Strasser says it to Elsa. He said, it's something like lives are cheap, or human life is cheap
human life is cheap. Yeah.
in Casablanca. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's because everybody who's anybody is there. And it almost reminds me, have you seen Between Two Worlds, which is, I think, 2 years after it?
Yes, I
Yeah.
have. Yes,
With Paul
yes.
Henrid, Eleanor Parker,
Mhm.
and that actually had Sidney Greenstreet and Edmund, is it Edmund, not Edmund Perdom, Edmund Gwen, John
Evan Gwen.
Garfield.
Hmm.
Yeah, but they're all caught in limbo too, and it's
Yes.
because they've been killed in a London bombing
Hmm.
raid, and they're on the trip to the afterlife. I don't know if that was very successful. I just know I saw it on TCM a long time ago, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. But yeah, and another relationship I wanted to talk about, because people talk, I think Renault and Rick it's a perfect relationship. Renault, he's kind of, he's going to be anybody's little bitch who's going to help him along. He's going to, and just the fact, I don't know completely how they got away with it with the production code, but he was, sleeping with women to get, so they could get their letters of transit.
And when you watch it, it's like, I always say on my show, the production code was stringent, but the really clever writers and directors knew how to get around things very, very well. Because a lot of things would go over censors' heads, it would go over, middle America's heads or whatever.
Hmm.
But a lot of the stuff that Louis Renault does in this movie is pretty blatant and they really spell it out. So I don't know if it's just that this is, this is a movie where there's such moral ambiguity and everybody is sort of jockeying for position, and
Mhm.
so they just kind of overlook it. I don't know if it's, the fact that, it was wartime and this movie, really was, explaining the evils of war. It's just really fascinating to me how they let some of this stuff get by, because, it's incredibly clear that Louis slept with the Bulgarian girl who just got married or what. It's very clear.
I
That's
know, and she asks Rick, "Would you
yeah.
forgive a girl that did something very, very terrible to protect you if you
Mhm.
knew that she loved you?" And you know that she's done that. I think part of that moral ambiguity, I know that the script was finished, not completely finished, but the
Mhm.
majority of it was finished and submitted to the production code before the Office of War Information Motion Bureau the motion picture bureau was set up on Hollywood and Vine, and a lot of the almost saccharine flag waving that you get from films like Tender Comrade and Since You Went Away was because of the Office of War Information. They wanted to make the war look as spectacular as they possibly could, and it wasn't until they went away that we got movies like Battleground, where we're like, what in the heck are we actually doing here? So I think being able to kind of exploit the evils of war was the fact that the OWI had not been set up yet.
Right.
And I think part of it just kind of because, okay, according to Round Up the Usual Suspects, they say that like Joseph Breen wrote a letter to I can't remember who he is communicating with, Hal B. Wallace or Jack Warner, that
Mhm.
said because there were lines that pointed to Louis having sex with the women so that they could get their letters of transit. There was something that pointed to that said, we can't have this in the movie. That is bad because people don't have sex, according to
According to the
the
Hays Code,
yeah,
yeah.
the Hays Code. But he also after they okayed the script and they made the film, they submitted the film to Joseph Breen. He saw it and then he immediately called Halby Wallace and told him how fantastic it was, how much he loved it. Which is it is a great movie, but some of the things in it, you're like, are you sure this was okay with you?
Mhm.
Are you just passing it by because it all works so well together?
Mhm.
Um, I don't exactly know what happened from point A to point B, and yeah, a lot of the little
Right.
details in the making of these films are lost.
It also makes it not as much as with Louis, but it also kind of spells out a little bit that Rick and Ilsa slept together in Paris,
Yeah.
too. That there are moments in the flashback where where you see them, almost going to bed together the night, or being somewhere the morning after. So you really it spells that out pretty well too. So yeah, this movie gets away with many things that I don't think. Yeah, you're right. A movie a year or two later would have. It kind of hit it right in that sweet spot.
Right, exactly. Well, and yeah, in Paris, I mean, in a film made today, they'd sleep together and we'd watch every moment of it.
Yeah. And
But
and I do and I do enjoy the mystery of did they or didn't they?
yeah, exactly. I know that it would have been looked down on the production code for her because she was apparently married to Laszlo when she was having the affair with Bogart. But
True.
at the time, I think she thought that Victor Laszlo was dead,
Hmm.
because he was reportedly shot at a concentration camp, which didn't end up happening because he came to Casablanca with Elsa.
Right.
But I think if they had not put the plot point in there that she thought he was dead, she wouldn't
Hmm.
have gotten away with it because that kind of adulterous affair would have been very looked down upon.
True.
Um, Talking about wonderful relationships, I think so many people talk about Rick and Louis, as we were a while ago, which I
Hmm.
think is a wonderful relationship. I think a true friendship is between Rick and Dooley Wilson, because Dooley
Yes.
Wilson is not it's a strange character for that time because he's not exactly a butler. He's almost like just a best friend that goes around where Rick is and plays the piano wherever he is. And I think part of it, if they'd been able to enlarge the character, which I don't know if they would have or not, but I think we would have seen that he knows Rick better than anybody else does, possibly
Yeah.
even Elsa.
He's the only one to really he's the only one you really ever see confide in Rick at all, or Rick
Hmm.
confide in. Rick and Carl have a few nice moments. S.C. Sakal's character. But yeah, it really is interesting how because Sam's a paid employee, just like everybody else in Rick's Cafe is, but he's part of Rick's inner circle, and the others aren't,
Yeah.
which is fascinating. And the two of them in Paris, they travel together. They spend a lot of their time together. It's a really fascinating character and really sort of forward for 1942. The only thing that sticks out to me that's kind of a little blemish is when Elsa refers to him as a boy,
That's what I was gonna say.
when she tells them to. But that is the only. I mean, in this entire movie, I think that's the only blemish on this otherwise perfect movie.
But yeah, she asked too, is the boy playing the piano, and it's
Yeah,
like, you want to restate that before I answer
yeah.
it. But I know, well, and that's kind of strange to me. You look at like the history. I know the OWI encouraged films to put characters of color in positions that were not butlers and were not
Hmm.
maids. You still got that throughout the war, and they also wanted characters of color working or fighting side by side, Caucasian characters, which I don't think always worked out that well. I think it was the previous year in 41, there were several giant mobs that attacked theaters in the South because Cabin in the Sky came out, which is all
Right.
black cast, and none of those characters are maids and butlers. They're living their own lives. So the fact that you have a character, Dooley Wilson, that is obviously not he's not any kind of manservant for Rick, and it's more
Hmm.
of a friend. I'm wondering if there were any, because I haven't been able to look if there were any stories. Probably, I don't know, any bad stories.
Not that I've heard.
Yeah, I know, like Lena Horne coming to MGM, she couldn't touch white actors in scenes because they had to cut out all of her scenes for when they show them in the South, which is
Oh,
one reason why she only sang in movies. That
it's the same thing with the Nicholas brothers at Fox. They had to,
Yeah,
they cut all of their numbers out of the movies. I think, well, finally, in The Pirate, Gene Kelly, made it so that you couldn't take them out because some of his biggest numbers are with them. So,
right. And
but
I
oh no, I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, but Sam is so nicely integrated into the story and Casablanca, it's he's embedded. It's impossible. But yeah,
yeah.
in musicals it was a lot easier because you can easily take musical numbers out, which doesn't make sense for a musical, but yeah.
Well, for the musical golden age of entertainment, where so many musicals it was just for the sake of entertainment, not for
Hmm.
furthering the plot. I
Yeah.
know that in the one of the original drafts of The Pirate, I've read that Lena Horne was supposed to be Judy Garland's best friend,
Hmm.
and finally they decided just to completely cut her out because they thought this would be just too much of a problem. So I know Lena Horne, the hairdressers would not touch her hair at MGM. They had to hire someone of color specifically to come in and do her hair, which is very unfortunate. But also, Lena Horne has a very interesting story with Bogart. While we're talking about Bogart,
Hmm.
that when she moved into, oh, I forget what neighborhood, was it Holmby Hills?
Holmby Hills.
Holmby Hills, the neighborhood, she was Humphrey Bogart's neighbor when he was married to Mayo, which is why he was having such a bad problems when he was making this movie, because they were constantly ripping each other's faces off, quite
Hmm.
literally. She said that once she had to sneak in the middle of the night, and once they found out that she and her, I think maybe her aunt or her mother and her two babies were living in that house, there was a petition that went around the Holmby Hills neighborhood to get them kicked out. And Bogart, said if he threatened this petition that, should you have any problems, you should come talk to me. And he told her, if anybody should threaten you, you send them right my way, and I'll take care of them. Which is I think is a wonderful, wonderful gesture of who Bogart actually was. I know you can watch him in this movie. He's a very slight man. He's very intimidating because of the persona he's come up with, but
Hmm.
he's not huge, and obviously he wasn't, just incredibly healthy. But I know that many times in bars after he started making films like this, people would always pick fights with him because they thought he was the bad guy, bad tough guy, Humphrey Bogart.
Hmm. Right, and but just like in the movie, he has this rough exterior, and yet everyone is poking at him, saying, it's that famous line that Louis says, "Underneath that cynical shell, you're at heart a sentimentalist," and so that is always at the core of Bogart in every movie, except maybe Treasure of the Sierra Madre or In a Lonely Place. But
Yeah. I
but
don't
Bogart always has this prickly exterior, but inside there is this there's this heart of gold, there's this sentimentality, and I think that's why audiences have been drawn to him so much, because there are so many layers to peel back with him, and you're constantly doing that in all of his work.
Oh, for sure. Do you have, while we're just kind of talking about Bogart, do you have any other favorites of Bogart's that you've seen?
Oh, so many. Bogart. I could do a whole show about Bogart's work, but I love,
Yeah.
certainly the African Queen is one of my
Hmm.
favorites. Certainly, I think he's brilliant in the Caine Mutiny.
Yeah.
Um, I think that one of my favorite film noirs is In a Lonely Place with him and Gloria Graham.
Oh, yeah.
Um, I and of the it's funny, of the four, I love all four movies he did with Lauren Bacall, but I think my favorite is probably their least known, and that's Dark Passage, where you don't see him for the first half of the movie. The camera is him,
Right.
um, but I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. But it's a quirky, fun movie if you haven't seen it.
It
But yeah, go ahead.
Agnes Moorehead is
Yeah.
just a trip. I mean, who else would fly off the handle and throw themselves out of an apartment building?
Yeah. But
But
like I said, Casablanca is my favorite movie, but if you were to put a gun to my head and say what's Bogart's best performance, Treasure of the Sierra Madre. He's brilliant. He is brilliant.
he is really brilliant. I haven't seen that in quite a while. I watched it on TCM maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. I need to get back into that. He
Yeah.
has so many wonderful films. I get so caught up in just like researching and watching this one specific film over and over and over again that I found that it's like I don't have time to watch all of the classic films I would like to. But he
Right.
is somebody that I really need to go back and watch. Yes, but Dark Passage, I think visually, anybody who's listening who wants to kind of look into the Warner Archive, all four of their films, To Have and Have Not, The Big Sleep, Dark Passage, and Key Largo are all available on Blu-ray. I think visually it is the most interesting because it is like walking into a noir nightmare.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me the most suspenseful, the one that always keeps me in my seat the longest is Key Largo.
It's yeah, riveting and disturbing.
Yeah, oh my goodness. And nobody else but Edward G. Robinson would be able to pull that off.
And Edward G. Robinson and Claire Trevor, those two in that movie.
Oh my
There's
gosh.
the scene where he forces her to sing is so uncomfortable, and she's so brilliant.
Have you heard that story behind it? The director, I can't remember who directed it.
John Huston.
John Huston, of course.
Mhm.
Of course, it's John Huston. Claire Trevor she kept asking him, okay, so when are we going to rehearse the song I'm going to have to sing?
Yeah.
And he didn't until the very day that they were shooting it. He was like, okay, get up and sing it.
Yeah.
But have you seen 2 Weeks in Another Town?
Yes, and
Yeah,
that is I think that is Claire Trevor's revenge on Edward G. Robinson for what she did to him
probably.
at Key Largo, because
Yeah,
she's terrible to him in that.
she's off yeah, it's one of those almost brilliant Vincent Minnelli melodramas that you're like, oh, you got so close to it being, it's like The Cobweb, so close to it being so great, but it just kind of veers into camp at
It's
times.
yeah, it's a great companion piece. It's not nearly as good as The Bad and the Beautiful, but it's a nice
Right,
companion piece to watch with The Bad and the Beautiful,
for
because there's a lot
sure.
of connections.
The use of Panavision and Metrocolor is very interesting in that
Mhm.
movie.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I got us way off track from Casablanca. I was
You and
like,
I could probably do this all night.
I was like, finally, somebody I can talk to old movies about. But yeah, I was gonna say you brought up, it's a fantastic ensemble cast, which I said more towards the beginning of the movie. I think one thing that made Hal Wallace such a fantastic producer is he realized talent, and he realized like everybody comes to Rick when it finally was produced on the London stage, I think around 1996. It got terrible, terrible reviews. Because I think it focused more on Rick and Elsa, who was Lois in the play, and she was actually more kind of she wasn't a likable character, I
Mhm.
don't think, in the play, which Ingrid Bergman made her likable, and so did the Epsteins and Howard Koch. That's the way they wrote her. But the fact that you have all of these tiny little ensemble characters running around, Hal B. Wallace knew, even though he was going to have to dish out more money, that if he could get some strong characters such as Peter Lorre, S.C. Zakal, Sidney Greenstreet, even Paul Henrid to play these smaller parts, that he was going to have a piece that is so much more fleshed out.
Isn't it funny that we associate, Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet with the lore of this movie, and they all have very limited screen time, and yet they are so indelible in the little bits of screen time that they get. You just think that they're on screen longer.
Yeah,
But Peter Lorre, we associate so much with this movie, and he's dead within the first 15 minutes.
right.
And Sidney Greenstreet, he has, three small scenes, but he's unforgettable too.
Mhm.
And SC Sakal has more screen time, I think, than Green Street and Laurie probably put together.
Right.
And I think that's also why I love this movie. It's like all my favorite character actors in one movie together too.
Exactly, and we could talk the rest of the night about, like, our actual favorite movies of each of the like,
Yes, oh,
SC's The
definitely.
Call. I mean, I associate him so much more with, like, Christmas in Connecticut and In the Good Old Summertime. Yeah,
He's got a great little scene in Yankee Doodle Dandy with
yes,
James Cagney. Yeah.
he does. Yeah, he's perfect in all of them, and talking about Flamingo Road, Sidney Greenstreet is one of his strongest, it's one of his I mean,
He's
yeah,
despicable.
he's despicable. It just makes you wanna root for Joan Crawford, who isn't that great
No,
herself.
she isn't.
No. Um, but yeah, it's almost like, the good producers, 'cause it was the producers ran the shows in the studios. It
Mhm.
was not the directors, which is very different today. Someone like, John Houseman, I don't know if you've ever heard of Nina Foch talk about executive suite. When John Houseman asked her shortly after she signed her contract with Metro, well, several years, because she had been at Columbia for so long, he said, "I want you to do this part in this film I'm producing at Metro." And she was like, "Okay, great." She was like, "Can I read the script?" And he was like, "No, go ahead and sign, and then I'll get you the script." She
Mm,
signed, she read the script, and her part in Executive Suite is tiny.
it
And
is.
yeah, and she said she got mad at him because it was so small. And he was like, "Just look into the character." And she spent all of this time doing this research and building this character. And producers knew actors that were going to do that and add, and she was nominated for an Academy Award even though she barely had any screen time
Yeah.
in Executive Suite.
Well, I just a plug, I guess, for my own podcast, but
Mhm.
we just did an episode on Network, which I dropped at the time of us recording this, and two performances in that movie that only have one scene, Ned Beatty and Beatrice Straight, both got nominated. Beatrice Straight
Mhm.
ends up winning, but yeah, you make the most of what screen time you're given, and sometimes an audience will remember you more than someone who maybe has more screen time.
My first experience with Casablanca was I got the DVD for Christmas. I think I was in 5th or
Really?
6th grade, and it was like the deluxe special 2-disc edition. I still have it. Probably won't watch it after watching the 4K Blu-ray. Won't ever watch it again. Because I'm like, yeah. Anyway, picture quality. But I think I said this. I felt like it was another stock kind of Warner Brothers melodrama at the time. And as I got
Mhm.
older and learned more about the Holocaust, what the world was going through with the war at that point, it became so much more impactful. And it's like, the script is just ridiculously corny. These films, these lines that we say are so corny, they work together so well when they're put together. And I think it was one of the Epstein's or Howard Koch who called it slick shit. They were like, we never expected it to be any good. But they just got it down to a fine polish.
It just works, like I said,
Mhm.
and I think it's because you're putting these lines in the mouths of actors who aren't to their core melodramatic. Because this movie is pure melodrama,
Yeah.
but Bogart is never going to sound melodramatic because he's too salt of the earth to do that,
Yeah.
and Ingrid Bergman is too sincere to make it sound like that as well.
Mhm.
If you put these lines in the mouths of someone like Betty Davis, we keep picking on Betty Davis. I love Betty Davis,
I do too.
people like that. It certainly would come off as over the top, but because it's in the mouths of people who really believe what they're saying and sort of take you off kilter and don't necessarily meet your expectations of what they're going to do.
Right.
It really works because I mean, the final scene. if you read that whole speech just on paper, it does sound really corny, but out of the mouth of Humphrey Bogart, it just sounds right, and it just sounds perfect, and it gives you chills every time you watch it.
Exactly, and it's his subtlety that adds so much to it, and for so many of these people, so many of these actors, it was easy. It was just like breathing, their
Mhm,
delivery on these speeches, and it was so beautiful. One thing that you mentioned, you said this very beautiful and glamorous club in Casablanca. I know that the original costumes that Ori Kelly had designed were much more glamorous than what we
mm,
originally saw in the finished film, even though we see them today and it's like we never dress up that much anymore
right,
unless we were going to the Met Gala. But
yeah,
still, I know that a lot of Hal B. Wallace had a problem with them being so beautiful, and like Ingrid Bergman was going to be in furs and jewels and silks and satins,
yeah,
which first and foremost, right, because this was being made, this went into production almost like 4 or 5 months right after Pearl Harbor was
Pearl
hit.
Harbor.
Yeah, and
Mhm,
so then the United States government started to ration everything, and so they were like, "Not only do we not have the materials anymore, this does not make sense for, like, Paul Henrid and Ingrid Bergman to be traveling with all of this finery," because they've literally been refugees themselves, have been on the run. Yeah.
No,
Yes.
I was watching one of the, documentaries on the Blu-ray, and it is interesting, and like you mentioned, it compared to us today, where, we're in a time where nobody dresses up for anything anymore,
Mm-mm.
and, so it does look extra glamorous to us, but I think Ingrid Bergman, she looks glamorous enough, but everything is so simple, it looks like stuff you could travel in, and it looks
Right.
like stuff that is easy to put on, but also everyone kind of also has their own color palette. Bogart and Henry are always in sort of white or cream, and then you've got the Nazis who are always sort of in darker
Mhm.
outfits, and Claude Rains is a little more ambiguous, so he's got a mix of stuff. So yeah, it really is smart, and it really is like we mentioned before. It's a lot of studio craftsmen who knew exactly what they were doing. They might not have all been like on the same page at the same time, but every decision that was made comes together.
One thing that one of your co-hosts said today that I was listening was like, the studio system may not have always been a great way to make art. I do not especially think it was a very uplifting environment for anybody. It was just a
Mhm,
bunch of people that were some of them were underpaid, some of them were overpaid that were all running towards a finished goal.
mhm.
But somehow they all came together in so many films to create different beautiful works of art.
Yes.
Um, yeah, and it's like they're giant repertory companies.
Well, and it's interesting. And the studio system is so full of just contradictions because, we think of maybe nowadays we get more artsy product, just because
Mhm.
there's more independent or in the 70s and 80s, and yet we've got corporations running movie studios. We've got people who aren't artistic whatsoever. And back then, you had men, one or two men running each studio who actually had theatrical backgrounds and knew what they were talking about,
Right.
and knew what scripts worked and what didn't and
Mhm.
everything. And so you would think that more artistic product would be turned out back then because you actually had people who had theatrical backgrounds and all of that. So many contradictions about that time, and but you're right. I mean, like everything, they wanted to make money, and yet because there were so many talented people doing what they did best, masterpieces were created.
Exactly. And yeah, masterpieces with their own identity depending on what
Mhm.
studio they were with. I
Yes.
think one thing that we've been talking about with Casablanca is, the studio Warner Brothers in particular was considered so progressive, so socially edgy, compared to other studios, because the Warners were, even though Harry Warner was much more of a conservative Christian than Jack was, they were very much against the like I said, the Nazi regime, whereas Louis B. Mayer was, well, I think they were all against the Nazi regime. I
It
think.
just they all were. It just, I think it took a little longer for some people do that just because they wanted their product to still play in Germany. I think that was
Right.
the
Well, and I mean, talking about Warner Brothers in March is, or Warner Archive is releasing Confessions of a Nazi Spy, which is
Mhm.
really the first Hollywood film that came out of Warner Brothers with
Yes,
Edward G. Robinson, who I had believe was a Jewish refugee.
he was.
Yeah, it was the first film because they were in 1939 to vilify the Nazis,
Mhm.
and they were terrified of losing that business, which is a reason so many 1940 films were not shot in Technicolor.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's the and what you're talking about, the differences in studios, and
Hmm.
if you look at, Warner Brothers does something like Confessions of a Nazi Spy to speak out against the Nazis, whereas across town Louis B. Mayer does something like Mrs. Miniver to speak out
Right.
against. So it's a difference in style, it's a difference in approach, but with the same goal, just a different way of going about it.
I know, exactly, and that's another thing, the so much Hollywood being towards FD because it was FDR's war at the time is
Hmm.
what it was considered, so it was considered a leftist war, even, and that's where the Academy Awards were, because in
Hmm.
1943, Mrs. Miniver won for Best Picture, and in
Hmm.
1944, Casablanca won, so you can see, they were all trying to push the war effort, and it
Hmm.
wasn't just because they were about the war, they were phenomenal films.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So many movies made during that time. I've said before. I think the World War II era is one of my favorite eras of filmmaking, just because so much of it was propaganda. But when you watch it, so many of those movies still hold up so well, and they still work. And you can always pick which of those studios appeal to you the most.
Mhm.
I love MGM. I love the gloss. I love everything, but I also love the realism of Warner Brothers. And so
Oh, yeah.
I think that was fun, and I think that was what was so great about that time is you kind of knew what you were getting from every studio. And if you were in the mood for something gritty, you would go see Warner Brothers. And if you wanted to escape and not think about something for 2 hours, you went to an MGM or a Fox movie. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, Betty Davis always said, the grass is always greener, but I heard her say on the Dick Cavett interview also. Of course, I've watched the entire thing as well. But she always said now MGM, that is where they made real women's pictures. And in my mind, it's like you might have had to fight harder at Warner Brothers to get your movies made, but I feel like they were socially they were better movies. They pushed harder than the MGM movies did.
Oh yeah.
Greer Garson and Katharine Hepburn might have had some phenomenal chances to play some phenomenal women, but none of them had the grit and the passion that Betty Davis did. And I feel
Right.
like that was allowed because she was working at Warner Brothers.
She was at the studio of Bogart, Cagney, and Flynn, so they weren't as interested in making, women's movies. So she and de Havilland, and they just had to fight extra hard. Whereas at MGM, they just kind of passed out the women's scripts like they were going out of style almost.
Exactly. Well, and by the time Joan Crawford got to Warner Brothers, Betty Davis had gotten it down to a fine art. So she was just
That's another story.
that is another story. You want to spend the next 2 hours talking
we
about
could,
Joan Crawford at Warner Brothers? But okay, so let's get back because I've read that book. I was just going to sit down and talk to you about why you love this movie, and I think we've definitely gotten this. I was going to say I don't think this movie would have existed without, which is a terrible thing to say. It's like this podcast wouldn't have happened without the pandemic. This movie wouldn't have
yeah,
existed without Pearl Harbor being bombed, because it the funny thing is that this script came to the story department at Warner Brothers on December 8th, 1941.
mhm,
So that's when they knew that the world was in war, and like everything, Hollywood has to exploit everything for money, and they knew they could exploit this war to make money, which is one reason why
yeah.
Casablanca got its way in.
Well, and there's so much serendipity with what happened with this movie, which is another reason why there's so much lore and everything because when this movie opened, the Allies landed in Casablanca, so it was on the front page of every paper.
Hmm.
And also, just put yourself in the shoes of a moviegoer in 1942. The war is not going well for us,
Mm-mm.
and I heard Steven Spielberg on the documentary on the Blu-ray say people were wondering if there was still going to be USA 2 to 3 years after that. So watching this movie, and you're sort of walking off into the unknown like Rick and Louie at the end. So
Right.
it took on a much different meaning than it does now because we know actually what happens.
Hmm.
But to be a moviegoer at the time and for it to be so relevant then, and it's still relevant now because it's a movie about sacrifice and it's a movie about putting the needs of others above yours, and it's still, those themes are timeless, but they were incredibly timeless in 1942 and 43.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, it's like, nowadays in 2020, we thought, okay, so where do we go from here? Is this the
Hmm.
end of it all? And,
Yeah.
audiences in 1942 could have been thinking the same thing. I've heard that it did like the Ally. Well, the film was slated for a 1943 spring release, but because
Hmm.
the Allies landed in Casablanca, Warner Brothers was like, no, release it now.
Yes.
And so so that's why so many people say it was made in 40. It's either 42 or 43, but it was made in
Where
42.
Yeah, wherever, it's funny, wherever you look it up, it's always different. Sometimes it'll have a 1942 in parentheses, sometimes it'll have a 1943 in parentheses.
Yes, no matter what, it
Hmm.
was up for the 44 Oscar. Well, yeah, the Oscar in 44.
Oscar for the 43 Oscars that were presented in 44, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it had to wait a long time for it to get Oscars. So really, I mean, the movie stayed on the minds of Academy voters for a long time.
Which is it means it was a great movie because the I think one of the biggest box office hits of 43 was Song of Bernadette,
Hmm.
which everybody thought was going to sweep the Oscars, which it practically did, I think, until, I mean, best screenplay and best picture, and Warner Brothers took those home.
And
So,
Michael Curtiz got Best Director. Yep.
yes, best as he
Hmm.
should. We didn't even get to talk about Michael Curtiz.
I love Michael Curtiz.
Yes.
He and Victor Fleming are the two directors which are not on the tips of a lot of people's tongues, and yet they directed so many great movies. Well, first of all, if you look at Michael Curtiz's career, you think he directed this. He directed The Adventures of Robin Hood. He directed Mildred Pierce. He directed Yankee Doodle Dandy. He directed Elizabeth and Essex. He
Hmm.
directed White Christmas.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Captain Blood. So many different movies with so many different genres, and he may not have had a certain visual style or a certain literary style like Hitchcock or Billy Wilder or something
Hmm.
like that, but he knew how to take the material he had and utilize it to its best potential. And that, I mean, I put him right up with those masters at that time.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, like you said, he didn't have a specific style
Hmm.
completely, but he knew how to adapt to the
Yeah.
material that he was working with. I know that when we did our Adventures of Robin Hood
Hmm.
episode, because Adventures of Robin Hood was the very first film where Jack Warner was like, actually like, oh, this is a master director, because Errol
Yeah.
Flynn had asked for William Keighley, which was not working out. So they brought in Michael Curtiz, and
Hmm.
he got the picture done well. And also his sets, they would spend sometimes 17 or 18 hours a day on
Hmm.
the set working. Hal B. Wallace was very worried at first with Michael Curtiz on The Adventures of Robin Hood because he knew he liked to be very, very prop and scenery heavy. And he
Yeah.
was afraid that they were going to get so caught up in the props and the scenery that you were going to lose the action that was going on screen. And
Hmm.
I think after The Adventures of Robin Hood came out is when Jack Warner signed him to a very long contract and gave him a lot of money. And yeah, I know he was a German Jewish refugee. Well, not exactly a refugee. He came in 1926 before Hitler had come to power.
Yeah.
But I know by the time they made Casablanca, I think he had had several loved ones that had died in concentration camps.
I think
Um,
so.
yeah, most of the people in that film did. So it was
Hmm.
very, very close to them. Yeah, Victor Fleming and Michael Curtiz, though, both definitely fabulous directors. I know
Hmm.
Victor Fleming most, of course, from Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. But like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, things like that
Okay.
as well.
A guy named Joe,
Yes.
Red Dust. So he did. Some of Gable did some of his best work with Victor Fleming,
Hmm.
and he did a lot of the Treasure Island with Wallace Beery and Jackie Cooper. So
Yes.
he did some solid work too. He died fairly young in the late 40s, so
Hmm.
he didn't get to do as huge of a body of work. But what he did during his time is pretty solid.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And so many of those, unfortunately, like Herbert Stothart, who underscored all of the films at Metro,
Hmm.
died the late 40s. And then in the early 60s, some of those people that worked on the artists that worked behind the scenes on those films at Metro, especially MGM musicals, just started dropping off like flies.
Hmm.
Which it was like, I guess this is the signal that we're coming to the end of this. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, you and I need to do just a whole episode on MGM musicals
We
sometime.
do. We do. I tell you, we'll talk about it for 5 hours.
We could.
Yeah. But I mean, I appreciate you so much sitting down and talking with me. I really appreciate all of your input. I love meeting you. I love talking with you. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today. It was awesome to meet you, Brandon. We are, if you've listened to this episode today and you have a problem, like there's something you'd like to add to the conversation, or you heard something that you were like, oh, I'm not completely sure if that's true, feel free to write into the hollywoodbabylonians@gmail.com. Or if you have a movie you'd like us to cover or talk about, please write in, and we'd read your letter on the air. We might cover your movie. Please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube at the Hollywood Babylonians for more Hollywood Babylonians content. Until next time, this is
Brandon Davis.
and Ben Burke. Thank you for listening to the Hollywood Babylonians. You have been listening to the Hollywood Babylonians. The Hollywood Babylonians is produced, edited, and hosted by Ben Burke and co-hosted by Brandon Davis. Audio engineering by Andrew Davis with artwork by Ben Burke and Jamie Lee. If you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, and follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at the Hollywood Babylonians for more Hollywood Babylonians content. Thank you for listening and have a good night.